Okay, this is our first video lecture for Humanities 1. I'll be throwing at least one of these up per week where I will continue doing what I do on our in-class lectures where I give you information that's not in the book or try to clarify or expand on information that is in the book. And you guys will be responsible for this. I'll probably have some kind of quiz or something as we go forward. I'll put that in my course announcements when I decided what to do about that. And the reason is that I've done this before, spent all these hours on video lectures for a summer class, online class, and at the end I realized it had been accessed by like 5 people, which was not a great day for me. So I do want you guys to access these videos and watch them because I worked very hard on them. So our textbook is where we're at is the chapter in your textbook is called The Flowering of Christianity, right? The rise of Christianity in the world. And so look, we finished with the Roman Empire and the decline of Rome. Christianity happens at the beginning of the decline of Rome, and no few pagans realized that this happened, and early on in the second and third centuries, there was a lot of uh, speculation amongst Roman pagans. Paganism didn't end immediately; it gradually kind of phased out as Christianity took over. But it coincides with the fall of Rome so closely that pagans of that age blamed the Christians for the fall of the Roman Empire. St. Augustine wrote an enormous book called The City of God, which is kind of an answer to that accusation. But Christianity arises at the very height of the Roman Empire. And in many ways, you can see Christianity arriving at the height of paganism, right? Paganism had done all it could do. It had created and sustained the most powerful empire in the history of the world. And Christianity comes in and blows it to pieces immediately. Well, not immediately, immediately in terms of human history, right? We're talking about 300 years 250 years, something like that, from the time Christianity begins with the events in the Gospels to the time when it is officially adopted as the religion of the Roman Empire, which once again is a blink of an eye in terms of enormous changes like that. Paganism had been going on from prehistory, right, for a very long time in one form or another in practically every culture until Christianity arrives. And Christianity arrives at the height of paganism, at the height of the greatest pagan empire in history, and changes everything. Um, and so this is an event that must be reckoned with to some degree. And in our culture, it's as scholars, when we're doing an academic study of this, right? We live in a Christianized culture. We live in a country where differences in religion are definitely tolerated. We have a vast variety of opinions about this, but we inherit the civilization that arose out of Christianity. And Christianity still has an enormous impact on our daily lives, whether we believe in it or not. Small things that we take for granted, like that children should be especially protected and cared for. That's a Christian idea. It didn't exist in the Roman world. Um, the people on the Titanic, as it's going down, saying women and children off first, right? That's a Christian idea. And the Titanic, I think I mentioned this in an earlier lecture. That maybe I did, I don't know. Um, the Titanic was spontaneous, right? This women and children off first when the ship is sinking is not some ancient law of the sea. It was invented by the people on the Titanic on the spot. Um, your Roman legionnaire on a trireme ship out in the Mediterranean that was sinking, if you said, well, hey, let the women and children off first, they would throw you overboard, right? Why? Why would we do that? It would make no sense to them. And so, because we take many of these changes for granted, we don't realize how earth shaking Christianity was, how many just basic assumptions about daily life were altered for civilization, the civilization which we inherit from the West, Western civilization, inherited from Greek and Roman sources. Um, when Jesus said, "Let little children come to me, because to such as these belong the kingdom of heaven," that was an earth-shaking thing. That was, everyone who heard that would have been shocked, absolutely shocked, and in some people outraged. How but children were not um, equal to adults at all in the ancient world, and let alone put above adults, right? So these, such as these, belong in the kingdom of heaven. And so Christianity is something we have to reckon with, no matter what we believe personally about it. Um, Now, I'm going to say some critical things about your textbook and about your textbook authors, and I'm going to try to be charitable about this. I don't have much good to say of them in this chapter. Um, I will say this: nobody's an expert on everything, right? You can't write a humanities textbook. I couldn't imagine. We have two authors, I think, for this thing, and I cannot imagine if someone sat down and said, "Hey, write me a humanities textbook." I'd have to do a lot of work, right? I am an expert on some things, not on everything, and so some of this may just be honest error. But some of the things your book says about the beginnings of Christianity are simply not grounded in fact. They are, however, aspects of scholarship that have been around for a while. Um, but I really am very much in favor of the Enlightenment value of belief resting on some kind of rational thought and objective fact, right? Are there facts that we can look at and say, okay, this is so and this isn't so? And do we know those facts? Do we adequately understand what we're talking about? And then can we think rationally about those facts? That's a very basic foundation of scholarship and ideas about the world. And that I don't want to get off on a tangent here, but that is something we are very much struggling with, or reckoning with, evaluating, reevaluating in our culture. Um, is what's most important, what I believe to be true, regardless of the facts. Think flat earthers, right? Or um, must my beliefs, must the things that I say, be founded in objective fact and knowledge? I'm still on that side of this debate, very much so, as a scholar. And some of the things that your textbook gets wrong are pretty basic. So let's look at some of those. Um, the um, Your book says something about the way that the Gospels came together, the way that the Bible was written. And it's true that the New Testament didn't exist for many hundreds of years, not many hundreds, a few hundred years, um, after the events in the New Testament, right? It's not like Jesus is crucified, then they rise from the dead, and the next week the disciples have a Bible in their hands. The books of the Bible were written in the first and second centuries after the events of the gospel. And for a very long time in Christian communities, these books would have been separate books. And they were circulated through the Christian community um, for a long time. Uh, Not every Christian leader or bishop or priest or pastor would have had all of them. Some did, but all would have had some of them. And they're, sorry about the dogs. I'm not going to edit or change or start over because this stuff, like I said, I'd never get done with these if I did. So if I get attacked by a cat or something, or a child, I will simply shoo them away and keep going. I'll try to get my train of thought back. Um, these books would have been circulating through the Christian community, and they're referenced in many. What we know of is the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the apostles' letters. Right, the what comes after the Gospels in the Bible are the writings of the people who knew Jesus, and they carry the apostles' names and also the names of the communities the apostles were writing to. These books are referenced by very early church authorities. So the people writing in the centuries immediately after the events of the gospel reference these books. And so we know that they were out there in the Christian community. But as far as gathering them all together into one thing and calling it the New Testament, that took time for that to take place. Um, so that's the process of this New Testament coming together. Now, your your textbook talks about the Gnostic Gospels, and these were other Gospels that were circulating around in not the Christian community, but the general population that were set up in opposition to the Gospels. Your textbook says they were simply alternate Gospels. They weren't. Um, they were set up as books opposing the Gospels. And the fact that they were not, these Gnostic Gospels are not quoted or referenced by very early Christian leaders, the people who wrote stuff that we still have with us, like the writings of St. Augustine, for instance, or Ambrose, or there are others that we have. They never mention things like the Gospel of Judas or the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Nicodemus, all these other Gnostic Gospels. And so your textbook seems to imply, and many scholars do say, that there were these alternate Gospels and that the beliefs of the early Christians were much more varied and much more diverse than originally thought, because we have these alternate Gospels out there. And that's just not the case. Right? The Christian community was very unified in what they believed. And I think the fact that these Gnostic Gospels are not referenced by any of the early church leaders is significant. If they did think that these Gospels were legitimate, you would expect them to mention them or quote from them, and they don't. And the other issue is that these Gnostic Gospels are really out there. The Gospels that are in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are very consistent in the kind of worldview they present and the kinds of things they say about Jesus, and they're very much in agreement. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the Synoptic Gospels because they relate many of the same events in the same order. John is different. He takes a different approach. But they're consistent. They don't contradict one another. The Gnostic Gospels are full of very, very direct contradictions of what you find in the New Testament. And I'll give you an example. One of the Gnostic Gospels, one of the big oppositions to Christianity early on was a group called the Manichees, and they took a number of forms. But the Manichees had a belief system that said that matter was evil, physical matter was evil, and spiritual things are good. And you can see some of this in the New Testament. We have talking about the flesh and the world as opposed to the spirit, right? That language is in there, along with a lot of other things that help frame that in a way that is not insane. The Manichees took that idea and ran with it. And so they became very extreme, and extreme in ways that were very dark. For Manichees, for instance, one of their highest goods, one of the best things a human being could do was to commit suicide, for instance. Suicide was seen as a noble thing to do because you were depriving the world of matter, your body, and freeing your spirit to be good. Having children, having babies was considered a sin amongst some of the Manichees because you're bringing matter into the world. They believed that every child, the physical body of every baby was evil. And in order for a human life to happen, you took a physical body, which was evil, and because you gave birth to this physical body, a good spirit had to then inhabit that body and become corrupted by it. And so we were better off just leaving these spirits out there to be good and not making them inhabit evil bodies, so forth and so on. um, which is in direct opposition to so much of what the New Testament is about, um, and directly contradicts many, many things that Jesus had to say and the apostles had to say. Um, so one of those gospels, I think it's the gospel of Judas, I'm not sure. Um, but this is an example of how different these things are. Um, so you have one of the things that happens in the gospel is the story of the crucifixion, right? And Jesus carries his cross. He's weakened from the scourging and the awful things they've done to him. He's lost blood. He can't carry it. He falls several times. And the Roman guards leading him to execution grab someone out of the crowd, Simon of Cyrene, and they make him carry Jesus' cross the rest of the way. One of the Gnostic Gospels says that when that happened, Jesus, who was a pure spirit, remember, think about the Manichees, what we just discussed. So for many of these people believe that Jesus could not have been an actual person in the flesh, if you will, because all flesh is evil, and since Jesus is good, he couldn't be in a body, right? So Jesus was only appeared to have a body, he didn't actually have one. It was an illusion, magic, if you will. And so at this moment, when Simon of Cyrene comes to help Jesus carry his cross, one of the Gnostic Gospels says that Jesus magically switched places with him. So Jesus caused Simon of Cyrene to look like Jesus, while Jesus changed his appearance to look like Simon of Cyrene. So it was Simon of Cyrene who was actually crucified. And this just gives me the creeps every time I think about it, right? But the way this gospel ends is Jesus is standing in the crowd laughing and mocking Simon of Cyrene on the cross because he has switched appearances with him. That's not an alternate gospel, right? That is a gospel in direct opposition to what you find in the New Testament. And many of these gospels were written with that stance. They began with that, which is why they have these names of apostles and the Gospel of Nicodemus. Not all of them are that extreme, but one of the very basic foundations of the way the Bible came together was the rule, right? Um, Something that's in the New Testament has to be written either by an apostle or by someone who knew an apostle. The Gospel of Judas, for instance, cannot have been written by Judas. Judas commits suicide at the end of the Gospels, right? There's no way that Gospel was written by Judas. It was written by someone else, one of the Gnostics, putting Judas's name on it. And they did. They would just pick a major character from the New Testament and say, this is the author of this, when it wasn't true at all. And so that's one of the things that your textbook kind of doesn't really explain well. The other thing that your textbook says, and it's just right there, it's this big, just little statement there. I'm trying to not exaggerate, but a paraphrase. Your book says, after his followers claimed that he was God, and then comma, Jesus never claimed this for himself, comma. That is so just not objectively so. Now, there arose in scholarly study of the Bible an idea called New Criticism. It happens in the 70s. And I remember reading an article years ago that an influential conference of Bible scholars had gotten together and had decided to put out a statement that Jesus never said in the New Testament that he was God. Now, that made headlines, right? And maybe that's what your authors of your textbook are going from. I don't know. But if you ask these scholars, you go and say, well, wait a minute. Why are you saying this? The New Testament has a lot of places where Jesus says that he's God. Their answer would be, well, those were added afterwards by the followers of Christianity. And that was the standpoint this whole conference took as a starting place, right? Your starting place is any place in the Bible where Jesus says, I am God, wasn't actually something that happened. It's something that this was simply added by later editors, added by Christians after the fact. So if you start with that as your beginning point, right, of course you're going to come up with the idea that, okay, every time we get to a place in the Bible where Jesus says, I'm God, we're going to say that wasn't really in the original document. That was added. And that's how you come up with a claim like that. Now, that claim itself requires some kind of proof, and they have none, right? There just isn't. How would you know, right? Um, Thomas Jefferson took that attitude towards his Bible. For instance, he literally cut out the parts that he disagreed with, and which meant all the miracles for him, that he thought those were superstition, and so forth and so on. So that's been the kind of way of looking at the Bible has a long history to it. But the documents as they stand, Jesus says many times, I am God. And just off the top of my head, I can think of at least three or four. There's a place in the end of John where he says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. I and the Father are one. In the Synoptic Gospels, when the soldiers come to get him in the Garden of Eden or Garden of Eden, in the Garden of Gethsemane, and they say, "Are you Jesus of Nazareth?" He says, "I am he." And then the story, the people who are coming to arrest him kind of are shocked. They fall back. They're stunned by this. When he says, "I am he," he actually uses the forbidden name of God, the name that the Jewish people thought was so holy they would not even write it down. In this book in Moses, or the book in the Exodus in the Old Testament, when Moses first encounters this God in the burning bush, he says, "Who shall I say to the Jewish people? What God am I dealing with here? Who are you?" And God from the burning bush says, "I am." When Jesus says, "I am he," in that instance in the New Testament, that's the word he uses. When he is approaching Jerusalem, right, he looks at the city and he sees the city in the distance and begins to weep over the city of Jerusalem. And he says, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, stoning the prophets, murdering the ones I send you. How often I would have gathered you in as a mother hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you refused me," right? That's pretty basic, right? People standing around would be like, "Oh, who are you saying you are?" And that was the reaction to him. One of the reasons he was crucified was because he said things like this. Um, a more subtle instance that C.S. Lewis points out in some of his scholarly work is when Jesus forgives the sins of strangers, right? They bring a person who's paralyzed before him, and Jesus looks at him and says, "Your sins are forgiven." Who forgives the sins of strangers, right? When you're doing that, you're making a claim. You're saying, "I am the one that all sin offends." Um, and so your book's just wrong about that. Okay, it just is. It is. Just, I don't know what else to say about that. It's just not the case. So maybe cross that part out. I don't know. Um, uh, let's talk about the Jewish people, because I said that Christianity arises at the height of paganism. It arises in the time of the decline, really, of the Jewish people. Remember, we looked at the major divisions in religious ideas in the ancient world. The pagans who did human sacrifice and terrible things for their gods, the pagans who worshipped gods of the powers of nature and the powers of emotion, the invisible powers of our inner world, and the monotheists, the Jewish people. That was it. That was your big three, ways of looking at the world out there, in a religious sense. Um, and the Jews are, part of that story, and they are involved in all of this stuff, right? They're in Egypt with the Egyptian civilization, and that's where Moses delivers them out of. They are in Mesopotamia. Abraham is from the city of Ur, which we talked about, right? The city of Gilgamesh is where Abraham comes from, and so they're there. And Christianity arises out of these people. Jesus is a Jew, and he's a Jewish rabbi, and it begins in Judaism. And this is where Judaism had gotten to when this happened. You begin with the Torah. The Torah is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the books of Moses, the books that the Jewish people believe that Moses wrote. The story of the beginnings of this new idea, this new one God that is separated from these pagan religions. Now, if you go back to these books, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, there's the story of Abraham and Moses, and the story of Genesis, the Garden of Eden. And then there's the law of Moses in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, um, are the rules, right? And the 10 Commandments are just 10 of them, 10 big ones, right? The big 10. There's all kinds of rules and laws in there about human behavior and action. And the Old Testament gives this kind of a vision of do these things and you will please God. And so the Torah is a foundational document for the Jewish people. It's a rule of behavior as well as a religious idea. And um, around the Torah comes the um, commentaries on it, right? So we just take some basic one of the 10 Commandments: "Thou shalt not kill," right? Well, what does that mean? It says you can take that in different ways. You could say, well, don't kill anything, right? If you smash a spider, are you violating this law? So commentaries about the law of Moses and this is called the Oral Torah. What the rabbis and priests interpreted from the law of Moses, and it was oral, handed down by word of mouth. This is how we think this. This is what we believe this means. You shall not kill doesn't mean you can't execute someone. You shall not kill doesn't mean you can't go to war. Because if you look at the history of the Jewish people in the Old Testament is blood soaked, right? They do a lot of killing. So there has to be an interpretation of these rules and regulations. This was eventually written down. So okay, let's just write this. Let's record this oral Torah. And this is the Mishnah. So the Mishnah is the early commentaries on the Old Testament and early interpretations of the Old Testament. However, immediately people began to say, well, this doesn't go far enough. It doesn't. The Mishnah is the oral Torah was a constantly evolving thing. New interpretations, new understandings were coming to be in the oral Torah. Once you write it down, it becomes codified in it, and it doesn't change. So there began to be commentaries on the commentaries, right? And this is the Gemara. The Gemara is the thoughts and ideas surrounding the Mishnah, which is the oral Torah, which is based on the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament. You see how this is getting convoluted here, right? And when Jesus shows up, this is one of his criticisms of this whole culture, is that they are bound up in their rules and regulations, and they're missing the basic point. And so the Mishnah and the Gemara are thousands and thousands of pages of commentary, right, on this stuff. And rabbis and religious leaders of that time of Jesus would have been very much about interpreting the Old Testament and interpreting the Mishnah and the oral Torah. And Jesus kind of cuts right to the chase. And you can see, once you know this, you can see some of the things in the New Testament become clearer what's going on, right? Jesus is violating the Mishnah continually in the New Testament. And he gets in trouble with it from the Jewish authorities all the time. And we don't realize this because we don't know this stuff, and we should. It should be part of our background on these things. Right? When Jesus speaks to a Samaritan, for instance, the Samaritans figure largely in the New Testament when Jesus is dealing with them. The woman at the well is a Samaritan. The story of the Good Samaritan is a parable that he gives. It was against the law. Part of the oral Torah was you don't talk to Samaritans. Having a conversation with someone who is impure, and the Samaritans were considered impure, would cause you to be impure. The story of the Good Samaritan doesn't make sense without knowing the oral Torah or knowing something about the oral Torah. The person who falls among thieves and is left there on the side of the road to die, and part of that story is that religious leaders, right, a rabbi passes by, for instance, in the story, and he sees the person in the ditch and says, I'm not going to help This person was going towards Jerusalem. They were probably going to the temple. You had to be ritually pure to enter the temple. And according to the oral Torah, if you touched a dead body, you were ritually impure and had to go through a very lengthy purification process in order to enter the temple. And so in the story of the Good Samaritan, the priest and the rabbi are walking past, and they are not helping the person in the ditch because they don't know if he's alive or dead. And so a Samaritan happens by who is not a good Jew, right? Doesn't obey the Torah or the oral Torah or the Mishnah, and he immediately jumps in and helps. And so in the story, Jesus is using a person considered unclean by the Jewish culture as an example of goodness, because the very fact that he is not a part of the Jewish culture, that he doesn't understand or obey their purity laws, is actually able to render compassion. And compassion is the higher value. And Jesus is constantly saying things like that. And the Jewish people, many of them are outraged by him. He says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. This is the law and the prophets. So he basically, in 2 sentences, sums up the thousands and thousands of pages of the oral Torah and the Mishnah and the Gemara, right? All this stuff. And says, this is it. Right? This is love people. You'll be obeying the law if you love people, if you love God, right? And he says these 2 things are related. If we love God, we should love others. This sort of thing. This is what Jesus did. So he shows up at a time when the Jewish religion has become tangled up in all these little rules and regulations, and he cuts through them all and outrages the Jewish people. He outrages the Romans because he's something new. The Romans haven't seen anything like this, right? Rome had no idea what to do with people like this. That's why the Christians were able to convert Rome to some degree. And I could talk about this for hours, so I won't. Another thing your book says, and I think it's important to look at, is the way that the Jewish religion was fracturing at the time of Christ. And your book gives a definition of sectarianism, and it's very a good description, I think. And one of the things that your book says is that the Jewish people at the time of Christ were having disagreements with one another. Think about it. There were all these interpretations of the Old Testament, right, that they're dealing with, and many of these interpretations were conflicting with one another. And you had the Pharisees, who considered themselves to be hardcore, the right kind of Jew, because they're obeying all the rules and regulations. You had the Sadducees, who were the more aristocratic, the wealthier of the Jewish people, the more educated of the Jewish people in general, who didn't believe in the resurrection, which is an Old Testament idea. And they considered themselves more rational and less fundamentalist than the Pharisees. And you had the Essenes, who aren't mentioned in the Bible because they are way out there. They actually just separated from everybody, made their own little community. And one of the things that drives sectarianism is this need to be more pure, to be better than. What I want to point out, in addition to what your book says, is that this is not a Jewish thing. It's not even a religious thing. It's a human thing. Every belief system ever, if it has any number of followers whatsoever, begins to fracture along these lines of who's doing it best, who's the most pure, who's the most hardcore. And when this happens, each group begins to isolate itself, right? It's, if I'm more pure than you are, I'm a better communist. There's an idea that is not at all religious, right? But communism, especially in the years of Stalin at its height of its power, they were murdering people hand over fist for not being good enough communists. The very word party line, this is the party line, right, is a central committee of the Soviet people would come together and decide what the right idea is. The word politically correct, right? How am I more pure in this way? is a human instinct, and it is, I think, a bad instinct, in my opinion. You see this everywhere. And this is a tendency. And you can, I think the psychology works this way. We live in a very fractured and very dangerous world, coronavirus, right? Um, if I can just hit upon a set of rules and regulations that make me okay, and I know the more hardcore I am about that, the more likely it is that I'm going to be okay. That's a seductive idea, and you see this tendency. In the amongst the Nazis, right? Right before World War II, there was an enormous. They call it the Night of the Long Knives. There was a moment when Hitler goes through and has a whole bunch of people executed for not being the right kind of Nazi. He felt that these people were strong enough within the Nazi party to actually uh, um, vie with him for leadership of it. So he had them all killed. Um, this happens. I think we should be careful of it. I think I really do. Um, I don't think it's a good instinct, and I think that it's any belief system you can see this kind of thing happening. Um, what else do I want to go? I know I'm going along here. I think that's it for right now. Um, um, I'll have some more to say about this as we go forward. I'll be, as we go through the readings, please pay attention to each reading that I have. I'll try to get ahead on these, but right now I just have, what to do for Monday. I will try to, stay abreast of that. Be watching your course announcements for any things that we might be doing, changes, this, that, or the other. And always feel free to contact me if you need to. So you have my cell phone number in the syllabus. Um, please use it if you need to, but also, of course, messages, um, email. I'll be checking these at least once a day. So stay safe, stay healthy. Hopefully see you guys later.